most scary snowfall horror stories. The snow fell relentlessly outside, the world swallowed up in white, untouched and eerily still. The wind howled through the trees, a ghostly wail that seemed to echo across the entire forest. Inside the cabin, Kylie sat by the fire, her face illuminated by the warm, flickering light. But her heart was cold. It wasn't the storm that made her uneasy. It was something else. Something else. A feeling. The feeling of being watched. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the mug of tea, but it wasn't from the cold. Her throat tightened as she looked around the room. The fire cracked, the only sound in the stillness of the cabin. But then, a noise. A creak. The floorboards. Slow. Deliberate. Kylie's gaze snapped to the door. Her breath caught in her throat. It couldn't be. No one knew she was here. She was alone. Wasn't she? The wind picked up outside, roaring louder, like a wild beast scratching at the windows. Kylie tried to swallow, but the fear had gripped her, settling in her chest like a heavy weight. Her mind raced, desperately trying to convince herself it was nothing. The wind, the storm, the old house settling. But the noise. It wasn't stopping. Then a soft buzz. Her phone. Kylie jumped, a sharp gasp escaping her lips. She stared at the screen. An unknown number. Her heart pounded. With trembling hands, she answered the call. "Hello?" she asked, voice wavering slightly, but she forced calm into it. "Calm down, Kylie. It's just a call." But the silence on the other end was too heavy. "Kylie." Her breath caught in her throat. The voice was faint, strange, almost whispering. "Kylie, you shouldn't be here." She froze. The words hung in the air. A chill crawled down her spine. What did that mean? What did that mean? "Who is this?" Kylie's voice was barely above a whisper, but there was no answer, only static, crackling. Then came a low, shallow breath on the line, and then a whisper so faint it was almost a murmur. "You're not alone. Not alone." The line went dead. Kylie's hands shook violently as she pulled the phone away from her ear. What had just happened? Her mind spun in a whirlwind of confusion and dread. Her thoughts were scattered, unable to find any sense of clarity. She stood up slowly. The cabin was too quiet, too still. It felt wrong. The wind howled outside, slamming against the cabin with a force that seemed unnatural. The room felt colder, though the fire still crackled merrily in the hearth. Kylie's heart pounded in her chest, each beat a loud thump of dread. "Kylie." Her name, whispered softly. Number no. She was hearing things. It had to be her imagination. The storm, the isolation, the silence, it was all too much. She was alone. But the whispering continued. "Kylie." It came from behind her. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned, but the room was empty. Nothing but shadows dancing across the walls. "Kylie." There it was again. The voice. But no one was here. No one at all. Her legs felt like lead as she staggered backward. "Who's there?" Her voice broke, a tremble of fear creeping into every syllable. The silence after her words seemed to stretch on for an eternity. Then, from above, the faint sound of footsteps. Slow. Hesitant. Almost deliberate. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. The footsteps were coming from upstairs. Her heart raced. Was she hearing things? No, she wasn't. She had to check. With every step she took up the stairs, her body seemed to grow heavier. The fear inside her gnawed at her, growing, twisting, as she ascended toward the second floor. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. But the whispering, the footsteps. She reached the top, each step louder than the last, as if the house was alive with her fear. Her breath shallow, her chest tightening with each passing moment. Her gaze swept the hallway, which seemed darker than it should have been. She hesitated. Then, she saw it. The door. The door at the end of the hall was slightly ajar, cold air seeping out from the crack. A soft creak echoed from within. She stepped forward. Her body felt heavy, the weight of dread pressing down on her like a stone. She reached for the door and pushed it open, the air in the room cold enough to sting her skin. And then she saw him. A figure. Tall. Still. Standing in the corner of the room. His face was obscured by shadow, but something about his presence made her blood run cold. Her heart skipped a beat. Kylie couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The figure remained still, motionless. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure tilted his head ever so slightly. The shadows around him seemed to bend and stretch. And then came the whisper, "Kylie." Her eyes widened and a gasp escaped her lips. The voice wasn't his. It wasn't human. "Kylie." The room spun. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe. Her body was paralyzed, frozen in terror. The air grew thick with something oppressive. It suffocated her, pressing in from all sides. Her legs felt like jelly as she stumbled backward, the door slamming shut behind her with a violent bang. She tried to open it. She pulled, yanked. It wouldn't budge. The whispering continued, louder now. It was coming from all around her. "Kylie!" Number. No. The voice. It was inside her head now, inside her very soul. "You shouldn't have come." She turned around, heart racing, her skin prickling. The room was empty again, but the voice. It was still there, still in her head, and she couldn't escape. This is very creepy Snowfall horror story number 2. Amy had always imagined how peaceful it would be, staying in a cabin tucked away in the mountains, away from the world. No distractions, no stress, just silence and the beauty of nature. She'd needed this escape. The moment she stepped into the cabin, the smell of wood and dust filled her lungs. The warmth from the fireplace was a relief against the bitter cold outside. The snow had started falling slowly when she arrived, gentle at first, almost like a promise of tranquility. But then, as night fell, it turned different. The wind picked up. A low, mournful howl began to echo through the trees, the kind of sound that gnawed at your nerves, crawling under your skin like it was alive. Amy stood by the window, staring into the night. The snowstorm had grown stronger. The visibility outside was nothing now, just a mass of swirling white. And she felt alone. Not the peaceful kind of alone. No, this was different. The house creaked around her, the silence punctuated by the occasional crackle of the fire. But then, knock. It was soft at first, barely audible. Amy froze. Her heart skipped. A knock? She strained her ears. There it was again. Knock, knock, knock. Louder now. Her pulse quickened. Who could it be? Her breath hitched. The nearest neighbor was miles away. The storm. The storm had kept anyone from being out here. Slowly, with her chest tightening, Amy approached the door. She peeked through the peephole. Nothing. Just the thick blur of snow and darkness. She exhaled, a shaky breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Maybe she was imagining it. She had to be. But then, another knock. More urgent now. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. A part of her screamed not to open it, to leave it shut. But her feet, they moved forward anyway. She cracked the door open, just a little, just enough to peek out. The wind rushed in, sharp, bitter, biting. Her face stung as it hit her, the cold seeping through her skin. But what froze her completely wasn't the cold. It was the figure standing on her porch. A man. He was tall. Too tall. His features blurred by the snowstorm, his body swallowed by it. His eyes, though, his eyes were dark, empty, staring directly at hers, unwavering. Amy's heart pounded in her chest. Can I help you?" Her voice was shaky, barely more than a whisper. She tried to steady herself, to sound confident, but it was hard when the air itself felt wrong. The man didn't speak. He just stood there, unmoving, like he wasn't even bothered by the storm, like it didn't exist. What was this? Amy's breath hitched, her chest tight. She stepped back, about to close the door, but the man's eyes, those hollow eyes, caught her. And for a split second, they seemed to burn into her. Like he wasn't seeing her, but something beyond her, something hidden inside. He raised a hand slowly, not to wave, not to gesture, but to point. Amy's throat went dry. She couldn't tear her eyes away from his outstretched finger. The world seemed to freeze around her. The cold crept into her bones. She felt trapped. Then, without a word, the man turned and walked away, vanishing into the storm as if he were a part of it, swallowed whole by the darkness. Amy stood frozen. Her breath came in shallow gasps. She couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't process what had just happened. What did he want? Who was he? The silence in the cabin was deafening now. The fire crackled softly in the corner, but everything else was still. Too still. She closed the door with trembling hands, bolting it shut. Her mind raced. She had to have imagined it. Maybe it was the storm playing tricks on her. Maybe I need to calm down. But then, another knock. A louder one this time, more insistent. Amy's blood ran cold. Her eyes darted to the door, and the question exploded in her mind. No, he can't be back. Not now. Not after that. She slowly moved toward the door again, dread pooling in her stomach, turning her knees weak. Her hand grasped the handle, but the knocking didn't stop. It didn't slow down. It became faster, desperate. Knock, knock, knock. Faster now. Her breath quickened. She wasn't imagining this. The handle rattled. Amy jerked away, stumbling backward. Her heart hammered in her chest. Who is it? Who is out there? Knock. Knock. A final, louder thud against the door. Then silence. The seconds dragged on like hours. The house felt too quiet, too still. Amy's hand shot to her phone, trembling as she unlocked it. The signal was gone. No connection. Not a single bar. Her mind raced. Why? Who? The house groaned. The wind howled outside, the storm relentless. She could hear the wind, but where were the footsteps? Where was the sound of movement? Everything was wrong. Then the knob rattled. Her blood went cold, her body freezing in place. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't even think. The door, it was moving. Someone was trying to get in. A sharp, breathless scream bubbled up inside of her, but it never made it past her lips. Suddenly there was a scraping noise, a slow, dragging sound, as if something was being pulled across the floor of the porch. A shadow flickered at the edges of the window. Amy couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. The minutes stretched into eternity. And then, nothing. The storm outside continued to roar, but in here, nothing. Amy sank into the chair, too afraid to move, too afraid to do anything. The footsteps, those haunting, dragging footsteps, had stopped. But Amy couldn't shake the feeling. She wasn't alone. She never would be again. This is the most terrifying Snowfall horror story, number 3. The snowstorm had been relentless for hours, an unyielding wall of white that pressed against the small cabin. The wind howled outside, like a wild creature thrashing against the walls. It wasn't just a storm. It was a force, a living, breathing thing demanding to be heard. I stood by the window, staring out into the chaos. The snow swirled in all directions, blotting out the sky, turning the world outside into an endless sea of white. Trees, twisted and gnarled, loomed like ghostly figures. Their branches reached out like skeletal hands, clawing, grasping. I swallowed hard, feeling the panic stir inside me. The wind screeched, rising and falling, making the night feel like it was alive, like it was coming for me. It was the kind of night that made you feel small, alone, and utterly insignificant in the face of nature's fury. I turned away from the window. Emily sat across from me, her eyes scanning the pages of a book. She wasn't really reading, I could tell. Her focus was distant. Her hands trembled slightly, the only sign of what we both felt: unease, fear. Something was wrong. Neither of us had spoken a word about it, but we both knew. We could feel it. I forced a smile, trying to make light of the situation. "It's just a storm," I said, my voice high-pitched, shaky. It wasn't convincing. Emily didn't respond. She just nodded, her eyes glancing nervously toward the window. It was a nod that spoke volumes, a nod that told me she was just as frightened as I was. She closed her book, standing up, and walked over to the window, as if she needed to see it for herself. She stood there for a moment, staring into the blizzard, her face pale. I watched her, unsure of what to say. Then, just as I was about to ask if she was okay, there was a knock at the door. It was soft at first. A tap. Barely a sound, but enough to make both of us freeze. Emily turned toward the door, her face draining of color. I froze too. Who could be out there? In this weather? It didn't make sense. No one should be out there. The knock came again, louder this time, more deliberate. My heart hammered in my chest. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. Nothing. No response. Just the wind. My heart pounded harder, and I felt a cold dread settle deep in my bones. Something wasn't right. Something was very wrong. "Don't open it," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Her eyes were wide with fear. She was right. We shouldn't open it. I knew that. But something was pulling me forward. I reached for the door handle, my hand trembling as I gripped the cold metal. The storm outside howled in fury, but it was nothing compared to the pounding of my own heart. Every instinct in me screamed to stop, to turn away, but I didn't. I pulled the door open, just a crack, and the first thing that hit me was the cold. It wasn't just the storm, it was something else, something unnatural. A bone-deep chill that felt like it was crawling under my skin. The world outside was a blur of white, the snow swirling so thick I could barely see. But then, just as I was about to shut the door, I heard it. A slow, rasping breath. It came from just outside. So close, too close. I slammed the door shut, my pulse racing. Emily backed away, her eyes wide, full of terror. "What was that?" she whispered. I couldn't answer. I didn't know what it was, but I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't human. I stumbled backward, my legs unsteady. My heart raced, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was out there, watching us. I ran to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek outside. My breath caught in my throat as I saw it, something standing in the yard. Tall, thin, its figure blurred by the storm. But I could feel it. It was there, watching us, watching me. Its presence pressed against the glass, heavy and suffocating. "Who is that?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper, barely a sound. I didn't know. I couldn't answer. My throat felt tight. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare at it. This thing. My fingers tightened around the window frame as I watched it move, just slightly. And then, it was gone. But I could still feel it. I could feel its eyes on me, like icy fingers reaching into my mind. Suddenly, the door behind me swung open. It wasn't me. It wasn't Emily. I was certain of that. My blood ran cold. We hadn't opened it. Not once. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The door was wide open, swinging slowly back and forth in the wind. And then, from the darkened doorway, I saw it. Its face. Pale. Twisted. Its eyes locked onto mine. Hollow. Black. Staring with an intensity that made me want to scream. "You can't hide!" The voice was soft, a rasping whisper that slid through my mind like ice. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I was paralyzed by fear, frozen in place, unable to tear my gaze away. The thing stepped forward, each movement slow, deliberate. "You can't escape." The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang, and the world around me seemed to collapse into darkness. "Run!" I gasped to Emily, but when I turned, she was gone. She had vanished. A sudden jolt of terror washed over me. I didn't know where she was. I didn't know what had happened, but I knew. I was alone. I ran. My feet pounded against the frozen earth, but the snow felt like it was closing in around me. I looked over my shoulder, but the figure was no longer there. And yet, I could still feel it, the weight of its presence, like it was right behind me, breathing down my neck. My legs ached. The cold bit into my skin. But I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving. The trees around me seemed to loom closer. Their branches, twisted and sharp, reached toward me like claws. The storm had stopped, but the silence felt worse, oppressive, thick. And then, a voice, a whisper in the wind. "You can't run from me." I froze, my breath hitched in my chest. I was alone in the woods, but I wasn't alone anymore.